Well, we are very attached to this idea, and if you think about it, it's actually quite hard to justify. Socrates doesn't try to justify it, he just does this and says we've now refuted the definition. But if one had to give a theory of what he's doing, then one would have to say something like what I've just said and you've just implied, that we all have within us the means for making the truth vanquish the false. And that's exactly what Plato does in the Meno. He produces, as it were, a theory of Socratic or philosophical discussion, which puts forward the suggestion that we all have latent within our minds the correct answers to these questions: what is courage, what is justice, and so on. And it's that knowledge, deep back within, not immediately accessible, that knowledge is what enables us to knock down all the wrong answers and show they're wrong, and that knowledge is gradually emerging bit by bit in the course of that bit of discussion where, for instance, one thing that Leakes says is used to show that some other thing that Leakes says must be false.
Now, I know that in your view, the doctrine you've just expounded for us ties up directly with what the basis is for Plato's most famous doctrine of all, the theory of forms. That doctrine must have been the most influential part of his philosophy in the whole history of philosophy. In fact, it's what the word Platonism has historically almost come to mean. Now, can you explain that to us?
Well, remember that these discussions which Socrates has are all centered on a definitional question. What is the definition of courage, of beauty, of justice? If now we have latent within ourselves the knowledge of the answers to those questions, and we have that knowledge independently of and prior to our experience of the world we live in, our using our senses, our going around from place to place, our knowledge is prior to that, independent of that, then surely what we know, justice, beauty, courage, must itself be independent of and prior to this empirical world we're now existing in. And that thesis is the fundamental assertion of the theory of forms, that justice, beauty, and the like exist independently of and prior to all the just actions, just people, all the beautiful things, statues, objects, any that you can find. Beauty and justice exist on their own and apart. That's the theory of forms.
This theory that there is another world than this, an ideal world, which is not this world, but in which everything exists that actually gives value and meaning to this world, has had incalculable influence on the whole of our culture, hasn't it?
Yes.
It's had immense influence on Christianity, for example. I don't want to go into that now, because I think we ought to stick to the philosophy, but that's just one example of the enormous influence that it's had.
Yes.
Yes. And
but I think one should be careful of using phrases like the world of forms or another world. Plato uses them, but the contrast he has in mind is not, as one might have thought, a contrast between one set of particular things and then another one completely like it except more perfect, more abstract, somewhere else, some heaven somewhere. His contrast is between the particular and the general. Those questions, what is justice, what is beauty, are general questions. They're not questions about the here and now, and that's the contrast. There's a point in the Phaedo where Socrates is saying that to do philosophy is to rehearse for death. It is, in fact, to practice being dead. Why? Well, because being dead is having one's soul separate from the body.
And not considering the things of this world.
And
yes.
In doing philosophy, you are, so far as you can, separating the soul from the body, because you're not thinking about the here and now. If you're asking what's justice, anywhere, anytime, justice in itself, you're not asking who did me wrong now, yesterday. If you're asking what's beauty, you're not asking who is the most beautiful person in this room. And if you're not thinking about the here and now, then, in the sense Plato's interested in, you're not here and now. You are where your mind is, not because you're in some other particular place, but a better one, but because you're not in that in place in that sense at all. You're immersed in generalities. So it's all right to use the phrase the world of forms, subject to the qualification that that means the realm of invariable generalities.
Yeah, so the word world here is actually misleading. We
Yeah.
mustn't think of it as a place
Right.
where certain spiritual things subsist.
Right.
Yes, yes. Now, these middle period dialogues that we're talking about now, I'm thinking particularly of the Meno, the Phaedo, the Republic, the Symposium, the Phaedrus. These were written by Plato when he was absolutely at the height of his powers, weren't they? And I think this is actually a good point for us to pause for a moment and think of their literary and aesthetic qualities. Why are these dialogues regarded, and always have been regarded, as supreme works of literary art? Why is that so?
They're so alive. I mean, a lot of other philosophers have tried writing dialogues, both ancient and modern, Xenophon, Cicero, Augustine, Berkeley, and Hume. But the only one of those ones I've just named who comes anywhere near Plato is Hume. And I think this is because, for Hume, like Plato, it's the process of philosophical thinking that counts at least as much as the answers. With Xenophon or Berkeley, it's all too clear you're reading somebody who cares about the answers, not the process of journeying towards them. Where Plato is concerned, we have to add his fantastic mastery of language, whether it's high-flown, imaginative descriptions or witty repartee, jokes, images. He's terribly good at making crystal clear the most difficult thoughts. You can go on adding, I mean, because in the end it's just that he's an artistic genius as well as a philosophical one.
Do you share the traditional view that his masterpiece is the Republic?
Yes, I do.
Why?
I think because it's in the Republic more than anywhere else that he makes good his belief that every question is connected with every other, and that the inquiry really can't stop, that even a conclusion for now leads on to the next problem. I mean, you begin with a straightforward question, what is justice? Familiar Socratic kind of question. That becomes the question, is justice a benefit to its possessor? And Socrates sets out, and this is really the task of the whole Republic, to show that justice is a benefit to its possessor, indeed the thing you need most of all if you're to be happy, whereas the unjust man is the most miserable of all creatures. But to do that, it turns out he has to give a theory of human nature. He divides the soul into three parts, and this is where he reneges on Socrates' thesis that virtue is knowledge. Virtue turns out to involve more than knowledge, though knowledge must be in control. And with the idea that knowledge is something that can and should be in control of the non-rational factors, you also get the idea, but now becomes possible, of a society in which knowledge was in control. So we get a whole political theory of a new, better way of life in society. All this emphasis on knowledge being in control raises the question, what knowledge, and what is knowledge anyway, and why is it better than an opinion? So you've got a theory of knowledge. The question, what knowledge the philosophers need in order to rule the rest of us, becomes an inquiry into the sciences. There's a lot about mathematics, a whole vision of understanding the world as it is that we live in is produced in order to support the claim that this understanding of the world as it is what should be in charge of ourselves, both individually and in society. And so all of that growing out of this one question, what is justice, the inquiry really doesn't cease until death, with the vision of the afterlife and the myth of Er at the end of the book.